Appreciate you taking the time out this morning for our first in a series of 3 webinars to talk about how to make more money with your land. And really, our goal with this series is to talk about some different diversification opportunities that many of our members and others across the state have in front of them. As we dig into these sessions, we'll start to turn our focus a little bit more on the renewable energy space. But really, from a Farm Bureau perspective, this is something we continue to get more calls on, but we've got members on kind of all sides of the issue and asking questions. And so we thought it was time with our partners at Indiana Acre and Indiana Ag Law Foundation to provide some general education and awareness to all the members as you might be making decisions on different opportunities for you and your family on your operations. Would like to thank the folks at Indiana Acre, Jasmine and Sarah Albury, and John Shoup with the Indiana Ag Law Foundation, because this has been a great collaborative process to bring this session to you, as well as the additional 2 that we'll have in the next couple of weeks. And so to kick off our session here, we'll have Dr. Jayson Lusk, distinguished professor and head of the Ag Econ department from Purdue University, is going to give us an overview of kind of diversification 101 and kind of walk us through some different opportunities out there. Jayson is well respected and brings a lot of great knowledge to the table for us. I think will really kind of help set the foundation as we look towards the next couple of sessions. So we're really excited to have him here joining us this morning. But with that, I believe we'll start to transition it over to Jayson and let him share some diversification 101.
Thanks for the introduction, Andy, and thanks, John, for helping organize this too. It's a pleasure to be with y'all here today and just chat a little bit about maybe options, opportunity, future. I will say at the onset here that, really my intention here today is to give a very broad overview. So I'm not going to necessarily give you a lot of details about any particular diversification opportunity, but maybe just set the stage for how to think about this and maybe some broad outlines, put some parameters around how to think about opportunities when they come your way. So it might be useful to first start by asking, why do we even care? Why do we even want to look for alternatives? Now, in a way, I'm probably preaching to the choir because you've already joined because you're interested in the topic. But nonetheless, I think it's important to understand where some of those extra calls that Andy mentioned are coming from. I think one of the issues is a variety of reasons for concerns about demand growth. Are we going to continue to have strong, steady demand for agricultural products, particularly those commodity products like corn and soybeans on out into the future? So I'll talk a little bit about each of those in just a moment, but things like population, ethanol demand, income, trade, some of the issues surrounding some of the plant-based alternatives. And then I'd say really up until the last few months, there have been concerns about relatively low returns compared to what we had seen maybe back 6 or 7 years ago. So I think those factors have been motivating to look for alternatives. And so let's spend just a few minutes talking about each one of those. So population. Now we don't often, maybe don't think a lot about population as a big driver of the health of the agricultural economy, but it is. In general, more people out there means more mouths to feed. In agriculture in general, we've come to expect this slow, steady increase in population as a continual pulling up of demand for food and agricultural products. But what we're starting to see, there's just a smattering of headlines over the course of the last few years, suggesting that, well, maybe we can't always count on population increasing at the rates that we have in the past. So those headlines about South Korea, China, but really also within the United States as well. If we look at projections from the United Nations of population growth, what we see is it really depends a lot on the countries we're talking about. So the blue dotted line here is high income countries. So mainly US, Canada, Western Europe, middle income countries and low income countries. And you see the projections for the United States and other high income countries are very low rates of population growth relative to today. In fact, if you look at the Census Bureau here in the United States, the projection is that population in the United States would actually start to decline within a couple of decades if we don't allow immigration. So we're just having fewer kids, and that's leading to lower population growth. So one of the things this suggests is that opportunities to capture some of that demand that will come from extra mouths to feed will be outside the country. And a lot of that population growth is going to occur in lower income countries, primarily sub-Saharan Africa. So again, I think that's one way to think about where at least some opportunities are, but also maybe a cause for concern about sort of long run returns from commodity ag production. Corn is the #1 crop here in Indiana, and a big use of corn is ethanol. Roughly 40% of corn goes to ethanol use, but a couple of maybe concerning signs there. One is the projections that at least some groups have put out with regard to the use of electric cars. Here's just one projection. There are many of these. Of course, projecting into the future is always risky business, but the orangish lines are internal combustion engines. The greenish lines are, hybrid or electric cars. And you can see this projection is, we get out a couple of decades or so, the majority or so cars may in fact be electric. How much demand will there be for fuel? And if there's not much demand for fuel through the traditional means, how much demand will there be for ethanol? Maybe a more short-term issue is the issue surrounding COVID. This is a graph up here about changes in consumer spending over the kind of entire economy. The top line is aggregate spending, but the bottom line is spending on transportation. And you can see the big drop off that we had, of course, about a year ago, but even still, running out to today, we're still about 38% below where we had in the past. So, less traveling, less demand for fuel, less demand for corn. So those things I think, maybe are, again, cautionary signs that are giving people pause to think about alternatives. Talked about income. Income's a little like population. People have more income, they have more dollars to buy things. That in general is something that we tend to think about pulling up demand. So GDP is a broad measure of income across all segments of the country. And what I've got here showing you here is the annual rate of change, or annual growth rates in GDP. And I've got a 10-year moving average because it wiggles around a lot from year to year. So this kind of shows us a longer run trend going back to the 1950s. And if you look at this trend, it's largely negative. It'll run up here before the problems we've had with COVID. But the longer run trend here is yes, the economy is still growing, but at a slower rate than it once was. So again, counting on that increase in consumers' incomes to pull up demand is one, again, where maybe it won't be as much as we have seen in the past. There's been the emergence of plant-based meat alternatives. I think that's also an opportunity, so I'll return to that maybe when I get to the more optimistic side of this. But on the pessimistic side of this, what if plant-based meats were to obtain a significant share of the meat market, the ground beef market? Some of the owners of these competitor companies, like say the Impossible Foods, their CEO Pat Brown has a number of times been on the record as saying his goal is to replace animal agriculture. And I think that would have some pretty serious repercussions, not just for animal agriculture, but for all the feed grains that go into feeding animals. So take soybeans, for example. Roughly 80% of soybeans go to feeding animals, either here or abroad. If you look at just the amount of soybeans, this is a calculation for one of my colleagues here at Purdue, Nathan Thompson. His calculation for how many acres, this is across the country, not just in Indiana, how many acres would you need to produce enough protein for 12 billion pounds of plant-based meat? That's this dark line down here, so a few million, versus how many acres do we have in soybeans now? Roughly 80 to 90 million, depending on the year. This is really an issue of feed conversion. If we just fed soybeans directly to people, we need many fewer acres than that conversion that happens when we feed to animal agriculture. So again, the underlying point here is if we were to see a big shift towards some of these plant-based alternatives, that would have some adverse consequences for traditional commodity type crops that we're accustomed to, say here in Indiana. And maybe to tie all that again together, I think the question is, what does it look like in terms of net farm income? So here's inflation adjusted net farm income. The blue line is across the entire United States. The yellowish dotted line is just here in Indiana, and it scales on the right-hand axis here. But you can see the 1980s here were a time of relatively low net farm income. In fact, here in Indiana, it was actually negative during that period of time. And we had some pretty good years, early 2010s roughly, but you can see the big drop off that we've had, and for a period of time have been down here in this sort of middling lowish period. This increase we see here is the 2020 increase in net farm income. We don't have Indiana's numbers yet, so this is just US numbers. So that's a bit surprising perhaps. How did net farm income increase in 2020 despite all the disruptions from COVID? Well, 40% of that is government payments. The CARES Act related and disaster type payments that came into the farm sector to help compensate for some of those losses. And as a result, this is a projection of 2021. USDA is projecting net farm incomes to be lower next year. But if we think about those questions that have been coming, I think it's really, we've been through several years here of relatively low returns to the farm income side. That's maybe a little bit of a background for some of the motivations that we're seeing now for thinking about alternatives. Maybe another question people have, just again, I'm setting the stage. What are historical trends in how farmland has been used across the country? So I've got about 9 major commodity crops grown in the United States. These crops are responsible for over 99% of all farmland in the country. So yes, there are other commodities grown, but they're a very small share of total crop acreage. You can see that, corn, again, #1 crop most years, and that's been that way for almost 100 years. But it doesn't mean things don't change. You can see back in the 20s and 30s, we grew a lot more oats, in part because that was when we had a lot more horses on the farm and other animals we needed to plow fields before tractors. So that, we have seen some shifts over time. The other big shift that we've seen over time is, a lot more soybeans than we used to have, and less wheat acreage. Instead of stacking those numbers together, if you just look at acres, in and of themselves, again, as I mentioned, more corn acres than pretty much anything else through the 80s and 90s. So a few recent years here where soybeans actually topped that. But you can see that here in this graph, the real rise in acreage to soybeans. So maybe one question we could ask is what's going to be the next soybean? What's the new commodity? This does at least show some evidence that new crops can come in and become a very dominant part of agriculture. But of course, some things drop off. Here again are the oats. This is the same data, just expressed as a percentage of the total. So I don't know if there's anything new necessarily in this graph, other than to say, in some ways you might think, we've got a more even divide of some of our farmland today than perhaps we had in the past. But again, depends sort of how you look at it. If you add together corn and soybeans, that's roughly 60% of all farmland acre in this country. In some ways, not a lot of diversity in terms of what's happening on our acreages. So shifting gears on you a little bit, I thought what I'd do is talk through maybe some broad principles in thinking about diversification. Again, I'm not going to tell you how you should, think about what you want to do on your land, but what I maybe can do is give you some broad things to think about. So I'm going to delve into each one of these in more detail in the slides that come, but just to hit the high points, I'm going to talk about the fact that your land and your labor has an opportunity cost. When we talk about diversification, and that's the word and the topic that John asked me to talk about here today, but diversification isn't necessarily always about just making more money. It's often about reducing your risks. So in other words, not putting all your eggs in the same basket. So, what is the goal? I think it's important when you're trying new things to look before you leap. We'll talk a little bit about some of that. Diversification often will require thinking out of the box and thinking about what are those alternatives that could be out there that aren't so obvious. Also, trying new things involves learning and trying to figure out what the rules of the game are. And lastly, would say that it's not just always about the dollars and cents. As you think about the alternatives that may be out there, yes, you want to do a budget, you want to think, project the financial returns, but there's economic decisions involve more than just dollars. It involves other incentives. So let's talk about each one of those things in a bit more detail. The first is maybe something that's kind of obvious, but it's something we teach in all of our introductory economics classes. And I think it's important to realize, and maybe again, this is a bit more of a motivation for thinking about alternatives, but that's simply saying that your land and your time have opportunity costs. What do I mean by that? I just mean that if you plant your farm ground of corn or soy, those returns you're earning, or that use of that resource in doing that land, you're giving up the opportunity to do something else. The same is true of your time. If you're spending your time in one activity, that's time you're not spending in another activity. And again, it sounds kind of obvious, but I think the question that raises some questions you got to ask yourself, which is, am I making the best use of my time? Am I making the best use of my land? Because there is a cost to not doing that. I'm foregoing other opportunities by choosing to spend my time and my land and invest my land in certain other activities. So I asked this question about what the goal is of diversification. And so I think that's a question to ask yourself. You may choose to do different things depending on the goals you're trying to achieve. Do you want higher returns? Is that the objective here? You want to maximize the chance of earning a high income. That will lead you to a different set of decisions than if the goal of choosing alternatives is trying to stabilize your income, making sure that you prevent the worst possible outcome. You may even have different kinds of objectives. For example, maybe you've got additional labor that wants a place on the farm. Maybe a child is returning from college, or a spouse, or a cousin, an uncle is looking for a way to make a living on the farm. Finding a way for them to be able to do that is another kind of goal that comes out of this. And then again, trying to mesh that with perhaps one of these two, I think is a good way to think about that. Well, I think maybe some of you might be saying, well, can it be both? I want more money in it, and I want it to be less risky. The problem is that's not normally the way the world works. There's going to be a trade-off between risk and return. And normally when we talk about diversification, we're typically talking about reducing risks, not necessarily earning a higher return. So, you buy insurance on your car, not because it's going to make you money, but because if you do get into an accident, you prevent the worst possible outcome. So you pay that little bit of monthly premium every month so that you avoid that worst possible outcome. And that's normally how diversification is discussed. In some ways you can think about adding a new enterprise to your farm operation is sort of, in a way, spreading your eggs across more baskets. So that if some of those adverse things that I mentioned, some of those maybe more pessimistic issues with regard to the outlook on the future, with regard to, say, maybe commodity crops come to fruition, you've got some other alternatives and you're ready to face them. Most economists would argue that there is a trade-off between risk and return. So if you want more return, you're going to have to take on higher risk for that. And one way to think about that, again, is just thinking about maybe, even stock market, that if you buy a single stock, there's a chance that it could earn a lot of money if it has some new invention, some new proprietary technology, what have you, but it also could go bust. So there's a lot more risk involved versus, say, a mutual fund. You've got, you invest in 10, 20, 30 stocks. Yeah, one of them may do bad, one of them may be good, but they help cancel each other out. Is the reason you're wanting to try a new enterprise because you want a higher income? If so, you might convert all your farm ground and move everything to that, particular enterprise, spend all your time and labor doing that. It's a more risky choice, but one that might have a higher expected return than maybe saying taking a part of your operation and dedicating it to something. Maybe a side comment here too, but I know we're talking about, how can I use my farmland in productive ways? But I think it's important to maybe think about and also realize that off-farm income is sort of a type of diversification. Spreading your risks across multiple economic sectors of the economy. These are data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that it's different size farms in terms of total sales. The median farm in, let's pick this category here, between 10,000 and 349,000 in total annual sales. You can see that it's about split between the total farm income. Most of that is coming from off-farm sources. But even these sort of more mid-sized farms, you can see some dichotomy here, more on-farm income, but still a lot of off-farm income, less true in the largest size farms. The point here is just to realize, I think, that engaging in finding ways to earn income off farm is a way of also thinking about diversifying the risks that you have on farm. One of the other broad principles I think I'd encourage you to think a little bit about is looking before your leap. So the interesting book some of you might have read, The Black Swan, probably is this Nassim Taleb's most famous book, but he has a different book called Anti-Fragile. There's some things about that I don't agree with in some of Taleb's writing, but one of the things that I think he does a good job articulating is, how can you take risks without risking everything? He talks about how to do that in a way that you can be, in his words, anti-fragile, trying to capture those returns of something new without losing your shirt. So for example, one of that is, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but maybe try 10% of your acres before, moving the whole farm in, for example. This looking before your leap, one can learn a lot from early adopters. And I think it's one of the great things in the meetings like we're having here and the ones you'll have in the coming weeks is you've got some people with other experience. Learning from those experiences, where the pitfalls are, is really important thing to do as you think about new opportunities. Sometimes when we think about, diversification opportunities or alternatives to, so maybe some of the traditional commodity crops, we're thinking of something entirely new and different that we haven't tried before, growing hemp or something. But, there are ways to diversify and capture some value add or some extra premiums that are marginal changes from something you may know a lot more about. So still growing corn or soybeans, for example, that maybe you're non-GMO or organic or have other traits or attributes that can capture a little higher premium in the market. You can try these things with and employ a knowledge base that you already have without, having to move to something that's entirely new or foreign to you. The other thing I think is really important to think about, particularly when you're thinking about new alternatives, is who's going to buy your product when it's sold. It sounds kind of obvious, like a sort of obvious thing to think about, but my experience has been it's one that often people don't pay enough attention to, because if you're producing number 2 yellow corn, your number 2 yellow corn is completely fungible with your neighbor's number 2 yellow corn. Any commodity, any elevator can take it. They can interchange it with somebody else. So in some ways, you don't have to think too much about who that buyer is if you're growing a commodity, in part because you're basically a price taker at any point in time. And your product is exchangeable with somebody else. That's not going to be true necessarily for products that are new, unique, where markets haven't quite developed yet. So, one way that, often emerges as a way to solve this sort of problem, to make sure that you can incentivize people to try something new, while also ensuring that they're going to have some place to sell it at the end, is through contracting. And there are different kinds of contracts in different forms of agriculture and otherwise. One would be a production contract where you're basically paid for a service. Say, a lot of hog production is done under production contracts. So the farmer doesn't actually own the animals. They may own the capital, the building that's on their land, but they never own the hogs. They're just paid to provide a service for somebody else that owns some of that inventory. That could be contrasted with other kinds of contracts like marketing contracts. That we have a contract that you'll buy under a certain set of specifications, where maybe we've outlined some premiums and discounts that can be achieved, and we're maybe benchmarking off some other price that's out there in the economy. But I think contracts are a way to lower that risk associated with trying something new. But when you think about contracts, I think there are lots of things to think about, and in particular the timing that's involved there. Particularly that is relevant if you have to make a capital investment. If I have to put in a new barn, a new facility, if I'm going to take out a loan to do that, how long am I going to be paying off that loan? Let's say it's 10 years. Do I have a guaranteed outlet for that product that's being produced for that 10 years so I can make sure and pay back this loan? So trying to think about the timing of the payback period with the timing of the market for the contract, I think is really important. Making sure you don't get stuck with some capital investment that you can't pay off. Of course, these things are, particularly new enterprises, are all up for negotiation, and the other side of the party there, may be willing to invest in some assets, specific assets under certain circumstances. But again, that's another thing to think about. If you spend a bunch of money on a hog barn or something else, can you use it in any other enterprise? Is it fungible? And if it's not, you really got to think about those incentives when you're outlining a contract. Option values, which is maybe another way of saying, can I get out of this if I want to? Or if conditions change, how easy is it for me to be able to reverse my decision? So when thinking about committing yourself to a future set of actions, what you want to do is make sure that you're compensated for giving up your future options that you would have if you didn't engage in some kind of commitment in a contract. If it's something maybe that's a little more different, maybe other kinds of marketing opportunities, I think having a marketing plan, for example, if you're thinking more maybe direct to consumer, farmers market, that sort of thing, who is your customer? How will you reach them? How will they find you? What prices are you going to charge? Those sorts of things. Having a plan is something I think that's critically important, because you can't just count on a buyer being there when you're done. And then also, as I mentioned, kind of have a backup plan. Sometimes I think opportunities arise if a processor enters a region, maybe in the past an ethanol plant that gives some opportunities that are there. But what if that plant goes out of business? What will you do? Will you have somebody else to take the crop that you've produced? You may not have good answers to that always, but having contingency plans, thinking about how to deal with those risks that you may be subjecting yourself to, are pretty important, and more important when you're thinking about niche and emerging opportunities relative to some of these big traditional commodity crops. So I encourage you to think outside the box. I don't know that any of this I've got listed here is outside the box thinking, but what are the alternatives? We've been talking about alternatives that are out there. We haven't mentioned much specifically, but there are lots of opportunities to think about how you can make money with your land or with your labor. Even within traditional commodity crops, I think there are opportunities to make some more money out there. So the emergence of some of these carbon markets, there are some people willing to pay a premium for non-GMO. I feel quite comfortable in saying I think a lot of the concerns that people have about GMOs are misplaced, but nonetheless, there are opportunities to make extra money out there. Engaging in those relationships often involves some contracting, something a little different than what you see in the commodity market, or even other value-added traits. You see this sometimes with certain varieties that may be in demand for certain processing facilities. There are opportunities, I think, even within the closer to the more commodity space for making additional returns. There are all kinds of new, I think, emerging crops that are out there. Hemp has attracted a lot of attention in recent years, as with the growth and interest of alternative protein sources. There's been a rising demand for things like pea protein, and will probably continue to be others. There's even some crops that had been illegal, but there are emerging new opportunities given changes in state regulatory requirements, things like marijuana and all the rest. Specialty crops are another opportunity in this state. We already have some well-defined markets and opportunities for specialty crops, things like tomatoes, mint, popcorn, but there are other horticultural kinds of crops, I think, that are of interest. In terms of just land use, there are, of course, lots of things that could be done with land. Tourism, ag tourism, having a maze on your farm. Pick your own, for example. Events, hosting weddings, parties, hunting, leasing out land for people to come hunt. All those are ways that additional returns can be earned from a given acre of land. As I've mentioned, and we'll mention more in just a minute, there are trade-offs associated with all those sorts of things. Value-added opportunities are there. I think if you look at the difference between what consumers pay for food and what farm receives, maybe a rough, crude approximation is about $1. For every dollar consumers spend, maybe 25% of that is because of what happened on the farm. Now, that doesn't mean there's some sort of evil conspiracy going on against farmers. It's just that there's a lot of value add that goes on in food consumption, a lot of processing, a lot of additional things that happen between those two steps. And there are opportunities there, whether it's in small local processing, maybe even direct delivery is something I think during COVID that at least anecdotally there appears to be a rising interest in. Maybe you could even add sort of farmers markets, these sorts of things in this category. I know one of the sponsors of this series of talks is focused on renewable energies. I think there's opportunities out there, whether it's solar, wind, or otherwise, that again, making use of the land, but also being able to do something entirely different with it. There may even be some opportunities as science progresses. I know here, even at Purdue, there are some engineers and folks in the agricultural college studying whether there are even certain kind of solar panels, perhaps that one are tall enough that you can still farm under. Now, it might have a drag on yield, but it produces a different set of income that's out there. So I think there's interesting things happening there. Poultry and livestock, I think, have long been a diversification option. Hog barns, layers, egg layers, turkeys, those sorts of things as an addition to another enterprise. one of my best friends when I was growing up, their family had livestock, but often dabbled in various kinds of exotic animals, emus, kangaroos, but there could even be the same sorts of things on the crop side of things. I don't know that I'd call an heirloom tomato an exotic, but I was trying to think of some example. There are some things maybe just, it's risky. If you hit the timing right, maybe something that pays off. Possibility of even pharmaceuticals or being able to, grow crops that are used in very specialized circumstances could be opportunities there. And then I think there are potentially, you're thinking outside the box. It's not just what am I going to do, but how am I going to finance it? How are the returns? How do I share the risks? And there are all kinds of interesting alternatives related to even possible financing. Yeah, you can go down to a bank, ask for a business loan to build a hog barn, for example, but there may be opportunities for equity investment, sharing, even maybe cooperatives. Open up your mind in terms of what's possible out there in terms of how you fund these new enterprises. Knowing the rules is tough in these circumstances, but to the extent you can, I think maybe also relates a little bit to looking before you leap. For many products, commodities are often state, sometimes local or even federal regulations affecting maybe you or your buyer. So think about things like hemp or particularly marijuana. Even if it's legal in the state, it may not be legal federally. And what does that do for a bank? Can they invest or not? If your hemp has a THC level above a certain point, all of a sudden now it's illegal. You've lost the opportunity that you had. We could give these examples. Meat processing would be another one. That a whole host of state and federal regulations that one faces. Some of your state regulated, often you can't ship across state lines. So all kinds of complexities that are involved there. And sometimes just because you're compliant with the rules in Indiana, it may not comply with the rules in Ohio or Illinois or Kentucky. I mentioned the importance of contracts. I think contracts have a really important role to play in mitigating risk, shifting risk, sharing risk across the value chain, particularly for new commodities. But I think it's also important to have these contracts vetted, particularly if you're being presented a contract from someone else, which is maybe just another way of saying, talk to John, get connected with the lawyers in the state, have them make sure your interests are protected. And I mentioned those option values. And if you did have a reason that you needed to reverse course, what are the consequences of doing that? How do you make sure that your interests are protected? I think are pretty important to do. And I think, thinking about and trying to understand what state, even local county ordinance are either around livestock facilities and also some of these alternative, energy opportunities. A bunch of challenges surrounding some of those. I think, here at Purdue, it's been probably 3 or 4 years ago now, but we put out a document talking about some of the issues around the state in different counties about putting in livestock, production facilities that, I think would still be relevant even today. As an economist, of course, I think the dollars and cents matter, but it's not always about that. Economics really is about trying to make choices that end up in your long-term best interest. And yeah, money is important, but so are lots of other things in somebody's life. So one thing to think about is, you try something new that may involve certain costs to you. There's a lot of controversy sometimes with even putting in, let's say, a livestock production facility or a solar farm. How are your neighbors going to feel about that? And are you willing to engage in some of those challenges that happen in local communities when you do something that's different sometimes? I'm not saying it's a reason not to do it, but I think it's important to understand that sometimes there will be trade-offs if you do something different than your neighbor. Again, not a reason not to do it, because people, doing something different often means making more money. But I think one should understand that there are sometimes some social norms that are out there, and one has to think about how you want to navigate those. The flip side of that is sometimes there's prestige with being an early adopter, right? I was one of the first to this industry. I was one that helped move this industry along, got it off the ground in this state. Those are exciting things to be a part of. So that's sort of the flip side of maybe, not being like everyone else. We all have different preferences. Some of us are more extroverted. Some of us are a little more introverted. Some of us like working with people every day. Some people like working with animals, some don't. And so, do you want to put in a livestock barn? Well, how much do you like working around animals? How much freedom do you want in your schedule? Those animals need to be fed and watered every day. It's not conducive to an environment where you're a globetrotter on vacation every week. So trying to understand those trade-offs and dimensions that come along with that. I mentioned, opportunities around kind of agro-tourism or, hosting weddings. I mean, that's, maybe you can make money, but if you don't enjoy working with people, that's probably not a job that you would, is a long-term option that probably you're going to be wanting to stick with. That being said, sometimes, you may be willing to try something that you're not really all that fond of because it helps you achieve some longer-term goal. For example, by, put in a livestock, production facility for 10 years, maybe that gives me enough income that I can pay off the land and move on with other things. So you may be willing to make some short-term trade-offs because it puts you in a spot later on where you have more freedom and flexibility to do some other things that you want. So lastly, I'll wrap up here by just asking some questions about what are some trends going on? What are some opportunities that may be out there? And I've touched on a few of those already, but I think one interesting thing just to note is that there's a lot of investment money that is flowing into food and agriculture at the moment. Here's an interesting site, this Ag Funder website that's counted what you might think of as venture capital type dollars that have come into agriculture. We've had some pretty phenomenal growth over the last several years. Even last year, they haven't put out a new report for all of 2020, but even halfway through 2020, despite all the COVID stuff, we were still on par with investments flowing in the food and ag space that were almost equal to what we've seen the prior year. Where are these dollars going? What kinds of companies are being invested in? This is a sort of discussion of some of those, but e-grocery, there's some retail stuff, but you can see some farm related, ag biotech, food innovation, ag marketplaces. If I look at the companies that are involved in the different parts of the chain, there's a bunch of investments on the food side, but most of these top 5 or 6 or 10 are almost all alternative protein companies. Farm deals, you see insects, a lot of kind of indoor and vertical kind of farming operations here. Some of it's kind of farm tech sort of things. And here's a set of examples of the kind of top investments in 2019 related to kind of ag biotech opportunities that are out there. Now, again, these are investments into companies, but you got to think these companies are going to have to, they need inputs from somewhere. And these may be opportunities that end up coming down to the farm level here in the near future. So last slide here, what are the opportunities and trends that are out there? There's a lot of them. I think in general, the consumer research that I do suggests a lot of buzz, if you will, around the combination of these two things, healthy and sustainable. And what kinds of foods, what kind of products can carry that kind of mantra of healthy and sustainable, I think are ones that will continue to grow in importance in the coming years. At the farm level, I think partially due to a change in administration, but also due to just changes in what some companies are seeing as market opportunities. There's, we're seeing carbon market opportunities emerge. So I think there probably will continue to be opportunities out there for reducing carbon impacts, certain farming practices that are associated with lower carbon emissions or even carbon sequestration. So I think, thinking about opportunities around that space in the coming years will be pretty critical. I've mentioned the alternative proteins and cellular ag. While some of this is a threat to traditional commodity production, there are opportunities. These plant-based burgers are agricultural products. You need a protein source. You need other agricultural products to serve as binders and other things. And because these are sometimes unique products, it makes sense that some of these might be grown on some kind of contracting basis. So trying to figure out what those opportunities are. Even some of this, what you might be called as cellular agriculture. So maybe it's the lab grown meat. Maybe it's even, this kind of synthetic biology stuff where they can create flavors in labs. Often these are based on, forms of fermentation processes which need a starch. They need a feedstock to go into there. So there will be opportunities that come out of these. Even the cellular ag stuff, even the kind of the lab grown meat sort of thinking things, it's possible to think about a world in which there's not just 1 or 2 big companies out there that are producing this stuff, but can you have a small bioreactor on your farm? I think it's an interesting thing to think about. COVID has changed all of our lives in very interesting ways, but one thing that may be happening is a lot of people are learning they can work more from home. If they can work more from home, maybe I don't need to live in the big city. Maybe I can move out to the outskirts of town maybe don't have to commute as often. So maybe the population may be changing in different ways, where there could be some opportunities for whether it's the direct farm to consumer, kind of agro-tourism things may change, more in the future. Novel farming systems, indoor ag, the kind of recirculating aquaculture, these sorts of things, I think are all things that, people are talking about at the moment. And some of those will fail, some will succeed, but I think there's certainly opportunities that are out there. I already mentioned the renewable energy opportunities that are there, but again, I think, just looking at trends, changes, incentives that we sort of seem to have both globally and in this country in the coming years, I suspect that'll be one where there'll continue to be growth and opportunities for renewable energy. And then the emergence of kind of digital agriculture, the data that we're able to collect now on farms, and how does that data change the role of the farmer in the food system, and the increased transparency, traceability that comes along with that. It may have some risks, but it may entail some opportunities too, as people are looking to be able to. A question on the side about my thoughts on diversifying via carbon credit markets. I think what I'd say on the carbon credit markets is there's a lot of uncertainty there at the moment. I know I've got a couple faculty in my department here at Purdue. Hopefully we'll be putting out some information in the course of the next several months, but probably a lot more is unknown than known. And I think some of the concerns, questions I think people have been having are maybe related to the length of the contracts that are involved relative to the payments that people are getting. If you're going to commit yourself to 10, 15, 20 years, are you being compensated enough for that risk of committing yourself for that longer period of time? I think that's a really key question. And if you agree to sequester carbon through, let's say, a no-till type production method, what happens if you get a certain weather year where you really need to till the ground? What happens? Do you have to pay back the contract if you release the carbon that you plowed into the soil? I don't know.
Questions that have come into the chat. Jason, if you can unmute, and we can kind of maybe address some of those from the panel or from our attendees. Looks like we've got one question. How do you think COVID will affect or possibly increase the opportunities for more of that farm to table opportunity? And I think it also kind of ties in with something you mentioned about potential relocation out of maybe some of the larger cities into rural Indiana and rural America.
When people saw grocery store shelves empty, that was, I think, for a lot of people, including myself, probably the first time in our lifetimes we've seen that sort of thing happen. That was really about a year ago. But I think it did cause people to think a little bit more about where their food comes from, and making sure about that we had a way to reduce, as consumers, reduce risks perhaps in food supply. So I think that sort of sparked some interest that has remained. Of course, in April and May of last year, we also had the problems with the meat packing plant shutdowns that brought also additional kind of renewed concerns with whether there was enough security in the meat supply chain. So I think those combination of events has caused at least some people to think a bit about those opportunities. Wouldn't say that, another challenge is that, farmers markets and all the rest were challenged because of restrictions to sizes of gatherings and all the rest this summer. So it wasn't as if it was just an easy sled for some of these more direct to consumer types of markets. But I haven't seen good hard data on what's happening to sales from more of this direct to consumer opportunities, but I think they're there. I think they're real. I think they're probably growing, and I think that's remains an opportunity, although a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk around there. It's not entirely new. These kind of box delivery sort of services have been around. We've also seen CSAs, this kind of community supported agriculture, where people buy a share in a farm, for example. I think those are interesting ideas. Again, they're not necessarily new, but maybe people's thinking about them has changed a bit over the last year.
And kind of staying with the food theme, and you touched a bit about it, as we think about from the consumer side, this alternative protein, whether it be plant-based or cellular culture, I mean, what do you see as far as a long-term trend and, maybe that competition for a conventional animal protein?
Sure. That is a topic we've been doing a fair amount of research on. So, if you look at grocery store scanner data, sales data from grocery stores, it's pretty phenomenal growth numbers. It's like 100% increases year over year. Now, some of that is because if you start from a really small base, you can get a large percentage increase. So that's one of the reasons that we've seen such phenomenal growth rates. But it still remains a very small piece of the overall meat market. So if you take all fresh meat sales in the grocery store, divide it, and then, that's on the denominator, and the numerator, you put sales of these plant-based meats, it's certainly less than 1% at the moment. So it's growing, it's small, and it will probably continue to grow. And I think the big question is how much, let's say, of the ground beef market can it take, or other markets? That's the big question. You have some of these investors that I've mentioned that are making big bets that it's going to take over a very significant share. You've seen even some of the incumbent firms like Tyson and some others make some investments in some of these companies that have got out of some of them. But if you just force me to guess, in 10 years from now, I would guess maybe 10 to 15% of ground beef sales are these alternative kinds of products. So I think it's real. I don't think it's going away. I don't think it's going to be all of the market either. I think the real key will be, can they get the taste right, and can they get the cost down? And they've still struggled a little bit with those two things. The cellular stuff, that's the much more uncertain. That's the real, real meat, so to speak, that's grown in a lab kind of setting. Those products have been, it's been about, for the last 5 or 10 years now, it's been that those will be ready next year. So we still don't quite see those in the marketplace yet. But there are some stories. Just Food is one of them that has a chicken nugget kind of product that's in the market in, I think, Thailand or somewhere like that. So they're coming, but at the moment they're still pretty pricey.
Okay. Excellent. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, especially with the change in administration out in Washington, D.C., climate, carbon, sustainability is kind of one of the leading charges for, we hear from every administrator or every department, agencies looking at climate. And so as we think about it back for farmers and their opportunity to play in this space, from an economist perspective, what's that value, per acre, per unit of carbon captured do you think it'll need to be to really get farmers' attention to play in that marketplace?
Yeah.
And drive change in practices? Sure.
Well, there for a while, for example, we had some pretty, rapid adoption of things like, cover crops and no-till. Some of that's kind of leveled off a bit in recent years. So you're right. It's going to take some incentive to get most people to switch and consider those. I think there are some longer term benefits of some of those practices that are related to soil health, but you don't necessarily see it in your returns this year. It's if I'm going to own this land and my children are going to own it, it's going to have value to me over this longer period of time. So some of it might depend on people's kind of time perspective. There's just so much uncertainty at the moment. And I think when there's uncertainty, that's related to this option value. If there's a lot of uncertainty, often you have an incentive to wait and see what happens. And I think some of that uncertainty is on the policy front right now. What's the Biden administration going to do? Are they going to offer payments incentives? Are they going to tie it to other traditional forms of farm subsidies? I don't know, but it's not crazy to think that could happen. And then how does that interact with these private kind of contracts that are happening at the moment? It's all very unclear at the moment, I would say. And I think one thing that's also maybe challenging to think about is, most of, say, the private market contracts, they're paying people to make a change. So what if you're somebody who's already been practicing, let's say, no-till or low-till, you've been using cover crops. It seems almost unfair in a way that you're not eligible for some of these payments. But again, what those companies are trying to do is document changes, not what's happened in the past. So I don't know, but like I said, I think at the moment, probably more is unknown than known. But I think there is value in waiting if there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. You know, what you don't want to do is think, boy, if I just, you know, it could go either way, I guess. But, you know, if you take a deal now, then prices look a lot better on out into the future. You know? And I do think actually one of the bets that players are making in the kind of these intermediate marketplaces is I think they're sort of betting that if they can lock in some of these you know, carbon captures, that markets may emerge where they can then resell those commitments for a higher price. And maybe they're looking at politics here in the US and the rest of the world and making a bet that that price of carbon will in markets that price those will rise. So I'm not giving any kind of specific answer here. I know I'm kind of dodging the question, but I know that, you know, so I apologize. I don't have more clarity on that front other than just to acknowledge, yes, it's a very difficult thing at the moment. One last dimension to that I'll say is, in addition to opportunities as a maybe income stream, this could be one of those things that also becomes a market access issue too. There may be certain companies that, you know, even elevators, you want to sell into that, you may have to document the use of certain practices, or you're not going to be able to have a market for certain commodity products.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up all very good points, and you touched on a couple of issues I think that that we hear from our members concerned is to your statement. You know, I've been doing no-till for 30 years and doing all these things, but I don't get paid because I'm not making another change, or we haven't developed the research or what's that next stack on technology that I can add to this that allows me to qualify. So I do think it's going to be an interesting to see how it plays out, but there is a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace for sure. One of the other questions we got, and it kind of ties back into one of your later slides around, you know, all the funding coming into the ag space. You know, we're starting to see some more private equity companies get into this land holding as a way for investors. I mean, do you think we'll continue to see that grow, and are there other opportunities in those type of arenas?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like a lot of these things, these are things I'm not necessarily an expert in, but casual kind of watcher of these markets. So I don't know what the trends are there, but it certainly feels like that's been a trend over the last several years. You have institutional investors that are looking to diversify their portfolio of holdings, and they're looking to farmland as an asset class that often is uncorrelated or a relatively low level of correlation with the overall economy. So it's kind of, you know, interesting. We're talking about diversification for the farm, but, you know, if you're the owner of a big pension fund, you're trying to diversify all your assets to make sure you can still meet your obligations to pay out those pensions. And so farmland has a variety of characteristics that make it an attractive investment for diversification. And so I think that will probably continue to grow. And what does that mean for a farmer? What are the opportunities there? I don't know. I mean, most of them, it depends, are buying farmland. So if you're in the market to sell, that's an opportunity. And this is not necessarily unrelated to the discussion about carbon markets that we were just having. So it's not impossible to imagine a world in which, if you want to sell your land into one of these kind of, you know, institutional, you know, private funds, that there may come a day that you get a premium for having a certain set of practices, because they can turn around and sell that to these big, you know, their institutional investors that are saying, we want to have ESG, the environmental sustainability guidelines, that we're meeting a set of sustainability metrics, and so that'll get pushed back down to the farm level one day. So it, you know, may affect the price of land when you choose to sell it. Maybe another dimension of some of this too is it's not necessarily your farm ground, but somebody needs to operate all this farmland that's owned by these you know, kind of holding companies, and so the farm management and all the rest. I think there, you know, will be opportunities there to the extent that continues to grow.
No, and I think, you know, we've participated in some calls, and you know, more and more the equity firms are, you know, their board of directors are telling them, you know, your portfolio has to have, you know, X volume of sustainability. I mean, and so it all does absolutely tie back in to one another and create some opportunities.
Jason,
Looks like
one other question. What, in your experience in working with producers and farmers and so forth, can you think of any like really good examples of diversification in action, where maybe you had that traditional row crop farmer that maybe thought about things and did a lot of the things that you talked about, about planning and, really researching a diversification option? Any war stories, good, bad, things that you've heard about people making some changes and further diversifying their operation?
Yeah, I mean, our department runs a farm management tour every summer, although we didn't get to do it last summer, but we hopefully will do that again this year. So that's been fun for me to get to go on those and see the kinds of things people do. For example, I remember a farm a couple of years ago, just south of Indianapolis. They had a wedding kind of venue. They built a barn that had, people could do weddings, receptions, that sort of thing, on their farmland. And that was, became a pretty important source of revenue, I think, for them over time. And it was something for other members of the household to be able to, use their labor in. So that, I think that was one that kind of stuck out to me. See, people, for example, that, I can think of people that are, I think maybe adding a hog barn or something like that would be a pretty traditional way of diversifying some income. But then, what about all the aspects associated with that? Management of that manure. So having an operation where you collect the manure, apply to neighbors' fields. That I can, think of a handful of operations where I've seen that sort of thing. Talk to producers that, grow tomatoes under contract for red gold, for example. In hearing them talk, that can be a bit of a risky proposition because it's something very different and very sensitive to weather and pests and those sorts of things. But if you can do it right and have the right relationships, there are opportunities like that. So, I mean, those are some things that, come to mind, but I'm sure there are many, many others. How about, I could turn the question back on y'all. What are good examples y'all have seen?
So I think the one that, and you kind of touched on it, the one that I think we saw really the last 4 or 5 years now it's slowed down is adding that hog barn, adding that poultry facility. I think that's been, what we saw a lot of diversification there, create an opportunity, diverse cash flow, bring the next generation back to the farm. But we're starting to see that kind of slow down. And I think and I think that's where this conversation we're having today, and then, what we'll have here in the next couple of weeks, and it seems we're getting more of those calls around this energy space, whether it's wind, solar. I've heard the digester conversation, come back in a little bit more here in the last probably 6 months. That kind of tailed off for a while. Again, I think a lot of it driven by partly the unknown coming out of Washington, D.C. and a Fed policy perspective. And you hear more about that low carbon fuel standard and the California carbon market. And, I think there's a lot of people asking the question. There's not, to your comment earlier, we don't have a whole lot of really good answers. So it's going to be, I think, fascinating to watch these early adopters, how they work through this, and what can we learn from those. And even especially those digester conversations, those ones that took that leap maybe even 10 years ago, and what can they share with the rest of us today?
I would add, Jason, from my perspective, my background is in the pork industry. My family had a swine genetics company. And one of the things that we worked on, and certainly, continues to be an area of emphasis for a lot of people, as you mentioned, is that, the deepening of the connection between you as a producer and the consumer. Farm to, opportunities not only with a consumer, but also maybe with a retailer to produce a specific pork product. In my example, could be beef or other things, but a specific product, again, much like you talked about earlier, understanding the consumer, understanding what that retailer wants, what they can sell, how to craft a contract that's equitable and a true meeting of the mind of what it is you're going to produce. So with friends in the pork industry, I continue to see that probably more now on the farm to retailer front. I think some folks feel like the direct to consumer maybe doesn't provide the volume necessary to be successful or earn a really meaningful income, but certainly to partner with retailers. And then the other thing is numerous examples of folks with, you mentioned the wedding facility, the party facility, obviously so many places around our state have scenic, neat areas for people to, utilize those kind of facilities. And certainly I've attended a number of them and seen a number of those as well. And I think that's a good opportunity.
Again, appreciate your time being with us today, Jayson. I think shared with the folks that joined us a lot of great information. I think one of the things that my takeaway from the discussion, and maybe more the presentation and the Q&A, is just there's a lot of opportunity out there for our farmers, our members, not only here in Indiana, but across the country, to look at those new opportunities, whether it is direct to consumer, where adding a specialty crop, adding an energy component to their operation. But I think it's going to be a really exciting time in agriculture and figuring out how we, the collective, we can work with folks like yourself and the land grant universities to help, clear the path of more of those unknowns, so we can, bring information forward, allow farmers to make those sound business decisions and diversify those operations. So again, Jayson, we greatly appreciate your time today. Just remind folks that next week we'll be back here again on Thursday morning. We'll have Terry Hall joining us, and she's going to take us through some information to really understand the ins and outs of renewable energy lease agreements and things that members should think about if they're approached to those. And so hopefully we can, again, continue to build some information and awareness of the members as we move forward and look for opportunities. So again, thank you everybody for participating today, and we look to see you next Thursday.